Hi, welcome to the Multiolelo Podcast Series. This is Anne, and today I'll be speaking to Dr. Scott Saft from the University of Hawaiʻi at Hilo about his book published in 2019, Exploring Multilingual in Hawaii, Language Use and Language Ideologies in a Diverse Society. The book provides a comprehensive historical and empirical account of the dynamic development and status quo of multilingualism in Hawaii. Dr. Saft also offers an abundance of microanalytical insights into the situated language use, language ideologies, and discursive construction of identity by speakers of Hawaiian, Pigeon, Japanese, and many other languages that can be commonly heard in Hawaii. Let's welcome Dr. Saft. Hello, Dr. Saft. Thank you very much for being our interviewee for this podcast today. Before we delve into the details of your book, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, such as your background and career in connection to Hawaii? How did you become interested in researching multilingualism in Hawaii?
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for having me today. I'm very happy to be here. So I guess I would start. I first arrived, I'm not originally from Hawaii, but I first arrived here in my early 20s and came from a mostly monolingual background on the mainland in the United States. And I was actually I'd spent a couple of years in Japan teaching English, where I got interested in language and linguistics. But Japan, although I was an English teacher, still has this at that time anyway, a very monolingual ideology approach to language. And so when I first arrived here in Hawaii as a young new graduate student, felt like coming to another world, another country. Just and I was aware of the presence of the Japanese language in the tourist industry, and that's partly why I chose to come to Hawaii. I was interested in Japan and Japanese the culture, but I really wasn't ready just venturing out, even going to play sports on the playground and hearing just a variety of different languages. Pigeon, of course, which was completely new to me, and I really wasn't prepared at that time for knowing what to make of the indigenous Hawaiian language, and that was in the early 1990s, and so that movement was really just gaining momentum. And so going to classes with speakers of Hawaiian and hearing about the movement to work on promoting Hawaiian was just, eye-opening. And then that doesn't even mention the other Polynesian languages that you would hear even on campus, just walking across campus, the languages of the Philippines and, language Marshallese and other so-called Micronesian languages. I just was amazed at this number of languages and this kind of diversity of people as well could exist in the same place. And so since that time, I've always had an interest in trying to understand this diversity. And it's just, the longer I've lived here and the more I've been involved in language teaching and with different languages and different groups of people, and so writing this book was one way for me to try to better understand myself, what I've been seeing for these many years, and try to make sense of it inside of myself. And then also, in a sense, kind of pay tribute to this great multilingual society that we actually have here surrounding us.
Great, thank you. So in your book, you drew on linguistic ethnography and language ecology to explore multilingualism in Hawaii. Can you tell us a little bit about these perspectives and why you chose them?
Well, yeah, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to focus on, society, Hawaii as a multilingual society, and how was I going to describe this, in one book, which of course is not really possible. So I was looking for methodologies, kind of larger methodologies that would allow for some analysis of language, of discourse, of actual language usage, but also make it possible to relate that to bigger issues in society. And the ecology of language has always been fascinated by just the concept, the metaphor that you have languages that come together and kind of form an ecology. And there were, the writing of Einar Haugen and others from back in the 60s and 70s, when you had the so-called Chomskyan revolution, and people weren't really interested in multilingualism, bilingualism. Bilingualism was still kind of treated as kind of interference, code switching. as kind of a negative thing. So I wanted to, in a sense, kind of pay tribute to these ideas that were percolating out there and from earlier on. And as I talk about in the book, the ecology of language as a concept, allows us to think about the relationship of the languages, but it really doesn't supply us with a whole lot of methods for actually analyzing the languages. And that's where the linguistic ethnography came in. And, as it sounds, you get the ethnographic part, but the linguistic, the focus on language. And it just so happened through reading, came across a group working in the UK who had been promoting what they call linguistic ethnography as a way of kind of merging the micro and the macro in the sense. And I especially liked the fact that they kind of promoted, they didn't really have one single approach that they were promoting. In fact, they were promoting that perhaps maybe a mixing or a meshing of different types of kind of micro analytic approaches might be one way to go. And so I kind of use that as kind of an umbrella term to bring in some conversation analysis, some ethnopoetics, some critical discourse analysis, some MCA, right, membership category analysis.
I see. Thank you. So in the first chapter of your book, you adopted a critical perspective to examine how multilingualism in Hawaii has been traditionally viewed as a problem. So first of all, what were some major events that led to the rise of multilingualism in Hawaii? And secondly, what are some examples of multilingualism in Hawaii being viewed as a problem and their underlying ideologies associated with it?
Well, I think the big events, we have to go back in history, and these are events that have been written about, talked about, described in detail. But the arrival of the missionaries back in 1820, who were English speakers, and of course, there had been other non-Hawaiian speakers who had made their way to the islands before that, but this really brought in a consistent group of non-Hawaiian speakers, English speakers. And then, of course, we have the rise of the sugar plantations, starting actually in the 1830s, but continuing kind of slowly, but then growing, especially in the 1860s and 1870s. And we had the Reciprocity Treaty in 1875, 1876, which allowed the sugar planters, and the sugar planters were mostly not the owners of the managers of the sugar plantations were not Hawaiian speakers. And so they were able, with the Reciprocity Treaty, to export the sugar more easily to the United States without significant taxes. So this increased the sugar plantation business, and all of this kind of led to more of a need of workers to work on the plantations. And so we get, from the mid 1800s on, this influx or bringing in of people from actually around the world, including Europeans. But the most famous groups, of course, are the Chinese and the Japanese and the Portuguese, and then later the people from the Philippines. And so, of course, this led to a mixing of languages. What's often not really appreciated is that Hawaiian remains strong as main language of society throughout the 1800s. And so first we had kind of a Hawaiian pigeon that was formed. And here I like to make the distinction between, small p pigeon as not a Creole, but a pigeon, and then what we come to call here now in Hawaii as a pigeon with a capital P is the actual name of our Creole language. But we had a pigeon with a small p, Hawaiian pigeon, and then eventually what we ended up with was a more English-based Creole that we call pigeon. Of course, it was a small p pigeon that, with the new generations speaking it, then turned into a Creole, or as we call it now, capital P. One thing that really stands out as our pigeon, capital P pigeon, was emerging, and as some of the the plantation laborers, such as the Japanese and the Chinese, had an interest in teaching their own children their heritage languages. And so we had actually a really well-developed system of schools. The Japanese, something well over 95 or more percent of the children of the Japanese plantation workers were sending their children after their regular schools to Japanese language schools. Had a significant number of Chinese also going to Chinese language schools. But as well, I guess, the heading toward like the world wars is often given as an excuse, but as United States influence, including the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 and becoming a territory of the United States, as the U.S. influence became more and more here in Hawaii, there was a kind of a fear, this fear of non-English languages started to emerge, and so the territorial government took action, often with the support of the federal government, to shut down the language schools. And it wasn't easy because the schools had a lot of support here in the community here in Hawaii. But eventually, with the war, the wars coming, and so the ideology would be this, Americanization, that to be truly American, to show that you are an American, you need to show that through the language that you choose to speak yourself, and that you also choose to pass on to your children. And so a lot of, especially the Japanese immigrants, had to kind of give up this idea of teaching their children the heritage language to show that they were on the side of the United States.
So in one of your chapters, you mentioned the strong revitalization movement of the Hawaiian language since the 1960s, beginning with a period that was coined as the Hawaiian Renaissance. Can you provide us with some examples of the efforts into revitalizing the Hawaiian language and the outcomes of the revitalization movement?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of people and places that should get credit for the movement, but we can see that the focus has been on the school system, on the educational side, and creating a system of schools that would serve as safe places where Hawaiian could be spoken and then taught to the younger children. So in the early 1980s, they created a system of preschools called the Punana schools, and they were preschools. So these are children who are going there and having their days conducted through Hawaiian. And this was, at the beginning, it was the 1980s, and you think people were a little more enlightened, but there was, a lot of pushback from the government, even from within the communities, and even some of the native Hawaiian families themselves were questioning, well, what's this is in the United States, and this, Americanization movement, you need English, and kind of this fear of bilingualism as well, might be harming our children by not focusing on English, teaching them Hawaiian, even though it is their, the indigenous heritage language. And so starting with the Punana Leo, and this just a dedicated group of people, on some of the different islands. It wasn't, there was one kind of organization, the Punana Leo, but it was, it took kind of a network and a growing network of people to help start working with the government, with the legislature, because eventually, focusing on the schools, they had to allow Hawaiian, what's now called Hawaiian medium education, continue into the actual, school system, the DOE, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. And so it took a lot of dedication. There were threats of being arrested for not following the law, which was the accepted law to teach through English. But they persevered, and eventually, almost 40 years later, but we now have an educational system where you can be educated in Hawaiian from preschool and all through high school. And now, we have programs at the universities of both Hilo and Manoa where you can major in Hawaiian, and we have graduate programs where we use Hawaiian as well. So we now kind of call it a P through 20 system, where the P starts with the preschool, and 20 is kind of you could do your doctoral work and get a PhD in Hawaiian, which you can now. So yeah, so a lot of the credit goes to those many people, and the growing number of people who persevered against the negative ideologies. And of course, right, there's still, I think you're going to ask me about the challenges as well.
Right, you mentioned about one of the emerging challenges would be the notion of authenticity. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about that.
Authenticity is, with the Hawaiian language specifically, is just we've skipped a couple of generations in terms of the transmission of the Hawaiian language. Typically, right, you pass, naturally a language on to the next generation. They'll continue to pass it on. Well, we skipped at least 2 generations of except for small pockets where people were still speaking the language. And so, the school system is trying to kind of recapture that. And is also promoting, have programs for parents as well. So trying to reinstate this intergenerational language transmission. One question that has come up, and it's definitely a valid question, is the kids who are relearning the language. And it's not just kids, right, as we know, it's also young adults at the universities who first come to the Hawaiian language and then start learning it, is that they are not learning it in a natural way. Even though school might play a major role in the child's life, it's still not the typical way that language is passed on. And especially here in Hawaii with English and with the strength of English and with the contact with English, there's a fear that the language that is now emerging is different from the language that was traditionally spoken. And that's usually where the questions of authenticity come in. And also I should mention that there are pockets of, we have the island that has been isolated and where it was kind of, supposed to have the transmission of Hawaiian ni hao. And then we have people who've left ni hao and gone over to Kauai, and they've started their own community and they have their own school. And that's another, it's been noticed that the language spoken by speakers in that community, and then what's sometimes called the University Hawaiian, that's promoted at the universities, there are differences in pronunciation in some of the word choice. It's just the final thing. I do talk about that in terms of authenticity, and I do some analysis where I try to show that our younger speakers, I try to compare the emerging Hawaiian speakers' speech with some of the tapes that we have of the elder speakers, and I try to show that there are, that the younger speakers are following at least some of the traditional ways of speaking. But I'd add, instead of talking about this as as a problem that might kind of cause a rift or cause problems for the continued movement, is I think we should look at this as kind of a good thing. People say in the teaching at the universities or teaching in the communities, and I just think that continued dialogue amongst those groups is going to be not have one kind of stepping in and saying, no, you're wrong or you're wrong. We still need all the people we can get to continue doing this. And so even if the language is a little bit different, but the goal is the same. And so I think we just need to continue this dialogue and turn what could be kind of a controversy into a plus, because there are indigenous societies out there, indigenous speakers of languages, different communities who struggle with this issue and have, different factions within the community. And that can sometimes just kind of cause problems in terms of trying to create schools and then trying to build up a program.
I see. So in this same chapter, you use a combination of conversation analysis and ethnopoetics to examine the practice of repetition by Hawaiian elders. And that is quite an innovative approach, since conversation analytic research on repetition has primarily focused on the practice of repair. So can you tell us why you combine conversation analysis with ethnopoetics, and what did you find by combining these two approaches?
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Excellent question. I took a little poetic license, I guess, there by combining two approaches that might not necessarily seem like they're easily combined. But again, in the license I took there comes from the overarching, linguistic ethnography that I decided to use, thinking that at some point I'm going to have to combine some techniques, some methodologies. And here in a way, I think I was building a little bit on some of the research that's been done by some people who are, have used the methodology of conversation analysis. And here I'm thinking about like Michael Moorman, Jack Bilmes has used CA to talk about culture and other issues that go beyond just the structure of language itself. So I feel that I felt okay, I guess, doing that is not the first person to have done that. And ultimately just the purpose was to try to just describe language as it was being used by the participants themselves, and then just to relate that, consider that as kind of a cultural way of speaking. And also in the back of my mind is that maybe, that kind of a CA type of analysis that looks at the details might be also usable later on by people who read that to understand that, oh, wow, yeah, we're talking about revitalizing the Hawaiian language, but maybe it's not just the words and the sentence patterns, but also the turn-taking patterns are also something that we need to really look at. And so what I was finding was that the elders frequently were repeating parts of the previous utterance, parts of the previous question. And because it seemed to be quite a large number of instances in the data, I felt that maybe this is a kind of a cultural practice, interactional practice that was engaged in by at least by this group of elders, and maybe it should be talked about as ethnopoetically as kind of cultural practice, a cultural way of speaking. And to me, that's the strength of ethnopoetics is really kind of embedding language within cultural ways of being, including cultural ways of communication. And so I was using that to kind of emphasize that what I'm finding here are structures, interactional patterns, CA style, but that also that maybe we need to think about that as a cultural way of communicating that might be valuable to remember when we think about what it means to communicate Hawaiian style.
That's really interesting to take a very micro-analytic approach to understand Hawaiian culture in a way.
Well, trying. Yeah.
Great. Next question. So besides the Hawaiian language, you also have a chapter dedicated to Pidgin. You mentioned that unlike the Hawaiian language, people have ambivalent attitudes towards Pidgin. Why is that the case?
Well, I mean, certainly it's from, the being told over and over again that, what they're speaking is kind of a broken form of English. The history here sees that as Hawaii became a territory, and then in the early 1900s, and as it was also thinking militarily and the need to kind of fortify Hawaii in that sense, that more families from the mainland U.S. came over and they were English speakers, and they needed schools. And they actually created these so-called standard English schools. They took some of the existing schools and they just kind of designated them as standard English schools. And some of the, the children of plantation workers who were speaking this Pidgin would have to take an oral test. And if they spoke with a little bit of a Pidgin accent, then they were told they can't go to this school because it's only for English standard speakers, and they had to go to another school. So from the very beginning, when Pidgin became a Creole, it is just, never really had a period where it was recognized as like this wonderful, beautiful new language. It was always being compared with English, and then Pidgin speakers were told they couldn't go to the same school as these English speakers because of their language. And as we know, that gets internalized.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of negative ideologies get internalized, and you still hear people who speak Pidgin, but then will claim, sometimes they'll claim that they do not speak Pidgin, or they'll even denigrate themselves and say, well, yeah, I'm not that good. You shouldn't ask me about English because I speak Pidgin.
So are there any active efforts into kind of removing this negative stigma associated with Pidgin and Pidgin speakers?
For sure. And actually on your campus over at Manoa, you have the Pidgin Coup, and Christina, Dr. Christina Higgins has done a lot of work toward advocacy, and you hold conferences and other workshops. So there's a lot of advocacy, in your island, and we now have people writing as literature now in Pidgin, and some of them, like Lee Tonouchi, is out there writing in the newspaper and also giving speeches and promoting Pidgin. So and it's being effective. Here on my island over here on the Big Island, we don't see a whole lot of workshops as such, but trying to teach more about Pidgin. Myself and a few other of the faculty here allow students to write some of their papers in Pidgin. I mean, that's kind of interesting because a lot of times they're kind of like, oh, I would never think about doing that. But then they start thinking about it and say, oh, it'd be kind of cool and fun. And they realize that they can do it and that it's, a good way of expressing. And it's having an effect. I mean, it's still, it's still a long way to go. But I think it was 2015 that Pigeon was recognized. It's included now on the census, the United States Census, as as a language, as a kind of an official language here in Hawaii. So it is gaining, here locally, and then also even perhaps, to those who know anyway, nationally. So just hoping more people will kind of recognize that it's a beautiful form of expression, that if you're going to talk about languages here in Hawaii, well, you certainly have to talk about the capital P Pigeon as a language that's born and raised here, right here with us.
Yeah, that's great. And reading your book, I realized Pigeon is really the epitome of multilingualism. You have mixing from Cantonese, Portuguese, Tagalog, Japanese, and so on. Just so many languages add up together to become this thing known as Pigeon today. So I think that's really worth exploring Pigeon and learning Pigeon as a language.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I have to give credit, a lot of my information about Pigeon, at least the structure of Pigeon, comes from, Kent Sakota in your campus, and then Jeff Siegel as well, the book, the 2003 book they wrote called Pigeon Grammar. I mean, that's for that chapter, that was one of my biggest sources, and should still be a source for anybody who's interested in learning more about Pigeon as a language.
I see. Thank you so much for sharing. So the next question, the focus of one of your chapters is on the phenomena of heteroglossia in Hawaii. Other terms that people might be more familiar with include code switching, translanguaging, and plurilingualism. So why did you choose to use the term heteroglossia?
Yeah, good question. This was kind of a tough decision because as you mentioned, there are a number of choices, and what I really wanted to just was point out just how prominent and how creative the mixing of languages is in everyday situations of everyday life here in Hawaii. But from an academic perspective, you're faced with all these choices of what term to use. And ultimately, to kind of make a long story short, I chose heteroglossia just because the connection to the work of the Russian scholar Bakhtin with heteroglossia, and he specifically talks about voices, this idea of multi-voicedness or multi-vocality, within speech. Even what seems like monolingual speech, there's all kinds of differing historical connections. But and then you can use that here in a multilingual speech, and then point out not just that you have mixture of Pidgin, and there's Hawaiian, and there's English, and perhaps some Japanese, okay, but then also the kind of the social meanings that are attached to those languages and how they kind of play into people's usage of those languages. So yeah, so that's why I decided to go with heteroglossia to make that point.
I see. Thank you very much. And the last question. So besides reading your work, what advice would you give to people who are interested in learning Hawaiian, Pidgin, or multilingualism or multiculturalism in Hawaii in general? Are there any useful resources that you would recommend?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll have to just pick and choose here because there are plenty of resources. Well, I mean, traditionally, there were not a whole lot of resources, but recently we've been lucky to get a lot more resources. There are some kind of more older texts about Hawaiian society and how it kind of developed, and talking about Ralph Kuykendall has a whole set of history, and then there are other books written by English speakers who are not really Hawaiian speakers. And those, of course, are good reference points. But I would also definitely encourage that we now have a whole group of scholars, native Hawaiian background, who have the ability to read and write in Hawaiian, but writing in English, and describing a lot of what's in some of the older Hawaiian newspapers that were, very plentiful in the 1800s and even into the early 1900s. And it gives a much different perspective, more of a Hawaiian perspective. And so here, like Noi Silva has a couple of books, John Osorio talk about some of the Hawaiian, from the Hawaiian perspective. And so it's not just that kind of, American kind of perspective there. And then the other thing, if I can, Anne, is just anybody really interested in kind of experiencing kind of the multilingualism in Hawaii would definitely encourage them to get out of our offices and students to get out of the classroom. And I know now with the pandemic it's a little difficult, but to get involved in some kind of activity here in society. If you play sports, well, to try to find an outside group to league, maybe to play volleyball or basketball or even softball. Then join a hula, halau, and other types of dance maybe as well. Because that, to me, that's really where my eyes were open, was just kind of being out there in Hawaii and just seeing and hearing all these different languages, and then talking to people and befriending people who had different perspectives that came from their different backgrounds and their different backgrounds with languages as well. So yeah.
Those are really great advice, especially for those of us who are already living in Hawaii, to get out of our comfort zone and to, talk to our neighbors and participate in everyday activities with multilingual speakers and Hawaiian speakers as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insights today, Dr. Saft, and I look forward to seeing more people reading your work and learning more about multilingualism in Hawaii.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Anne. Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these fun things with somebody.